In this lecture, I'm covering a rather wide field, and perhaps the first thing I do find when we do this lecture, and you see the chart up here, and people see the word philosophy, and that causes a slight note of apprehension because they think, well, now, this is going to be very dry. They conjure up a picture of one of those bearded professors. Well, you can see I haven't got the beard. And they carry very heavy tomes under their arm, and they speak in very, shall we say, abstract language which no one can understand. Sometimes I suspect they can't understand themselves. So please be at ease as we come to look at this word, which is absolutely vital to an understanding of what we're going to discuss. The word is derived from the Greek, and in the sense I'm going to use it, because I wouldn't get any marks at all in a philosophy course at a university, but in the sense I'm going to use it, it is the search for wisdom or the search for truth, or to use a layman's term, it is simply, what is your point of view? Now at this stage we find those people who say, well, look, please don't burden me with all of that. I'm just a practical sort of a person. You know, all this highfalutin nonsense about philosophy and ideas and points of view, that's quite beyond me. Well, I think we ought to spend a few minutes on this and see how important it is. Some years ago, a very distinguished British ambassador by the name of Sir David Kelly, he'd served in Moscow for many years and was a recognized authority on that totalitarian system we generally call communism. And one of the British popular newspapers asked Sir David Kelly to do a series of articles, but please, Sir David, don't let's have into that philosophy stuff. You see, we're got just popular style readers, and we just want to hear about communism. Well, as Sir David Kelly said, how can you discuss communism if you don't discuss the philosophy of communism? What undergirds communism? And when you look at that, you find, for example, the communist mind is rather different to our mind. In their approach to what is called truth is rather different. We won't go into except to say, in essence, that the Marxist teaches there is only one reality. That is matter. There's no other reality beyond matter. And in fact, you might say, well, that's not very illuminating, because we've had a lot of philosophies of materialism, but the great contribution for the communists, the Marxists say, was the great contribution. Marx allegedly was a discoverer of a great law, and it's called, by that rather large mouthful, called the law of dialectics, the essence of which is that matter is constantly in motion and the whole of development takes place through violence. There's no other way to have development except through violence. Now, if you grasp how the communist mind thinks, then you begin to understand why they act as they do. You begin to understand that, for example, it's no use saying to a communist or a very dedicated communist, look, you're telling lies, because he'll return to you and say, look, what I'm saying today furthers Marxism much better than saying the opposite yesterday. So what is true today might contradict what was said yesterday, but that's nothing to do with what I'm about. It's no good saying to a communist and expostulating, look, you murder people, millions of them, because they just simply regard human beings as higher animals. The communists are the highest animals of all. And if you're an elite and you're a higher animal, well then, if you've got to, as they put it, remove some of your fellow animals, that's what they call a social necessity. Now, that's the importance of philosophy. I rather recall the story of the old farmer discussing this, and he said he was a practical man too, and that business philosophy had nothing to do with him. But I said, yes, I said, we've all got a philosophy. So I put this to him. Now I said, supposing your tractor broke down, and you knew your neighbour next door had a brand new tractor, he wasn't home, why not go and help yourself to his new tractor? Oh, no, he said, I couldn't do that. Why couldn't you do that? He was a bit puzzled why I should put that question. Well, he said, that would be stealing. Well, I said, what's wrong with that? He was even more staggered. Well, he said, that's wrong. Well, I said, what's wrong with stealing? And after a bit of puzzling exchange, I said, you see, sir, you have got a philosophy. You've got a point of view. Your point of view concerning property is one you've been brought up with. You respect your neighbour's property. That's your philosophy. Or you could take it even further, a more extreme case, to Farmer Job Smith, who didn't like his neighbour at all. In fact, you'd have to say hated him. And you say to him, well, look, you've got a good double-barrel shotgun, why not just go down and remove your problem? He threw his arms up in horror. Oh, he said, couldn't do that. Why not? Well, that's murder. Yeah, but what's wrong with that? Oh, well, eventually get down to it. You see, even he believes, much as he disliked his neighbour, he had basic fundamental rights which he derived from God. His life was on lease from God. He had no right to take it, even though he disliked that man. So you see, he had a philosophy too. Now, most of our points of view are inculcated into us. As we grow up, it's part of our culture. And so it is absolutely important we be quite clear about it. And ringing down through the ages still comes that tremendous question. What is truth? What is truth? You'll all recall the gentleman that asked that, he washed his hands of it, a bit too hard for him. But that's the central question of history. What is truth? Well, as Jeremy Lee put it, of course, Christ said he was the truth, he was the way. But there's more to it, of course, than that. What is truth? Now, as we come to ask this question and answer it, the first thing we've got to do is to make up our minds between 2 points of view. And here I would suggest to you, as Jeremy Lee has put to you, from a Christian point of view at least, the individual who's perhaps the most difficult is that person we call the liberal, the small L liberal. The small L liberal in the main is quite a decent sort of a fellow, but he's quite convinced there's no such thing as absolutes in the sense I'm going to start to talk about them. He constantly talks about what ought to be, how things ought to be. And because they ought to be, and he can think it up in his mind, that's how, in fact, he believes he can make it. I think one of the most important little essays you can read at this time, if you haven't read it, is this one by Malcolm Muggeridge, The Great Liberal Death Wish. A brilliant little essay by one of the masters of the English language, and goes right to the core of this problem, the cleavage between the point of view of those who say, because man in his own mind can think up what ought to be, and he's got something called reason and logic, therefore he can make it be that. But there's the other point of view, which I'm going to put to you very simply: the rules of this universe transcend human thinking. And just from a common sense point of view, apart from any other, the sensible thing to do is to discover what those rules are and then obey the rules. Now, the plight of the world today is a result of the liberal mind, which is the forerunner of the communist mind, constantly saying, well, because we've got something called intelligence and much else, we can conjure up a world as it ought to be. The liberal in the main is a supporter of utopias. And then, of course, we've got to go on from there as we look at these words, and I'm the first to agree there are difficulties in discussing these matters, and perhaps at question time you'll take up some of these points. People get so taken up with what we call the word, and I regret to say I think many Christians are like this, such concentration on the word, we overlook the fact that a word is a symbol And in reality, what we're concerned is with the truth behind the symbol. And many people get hooked on the word. And that's one of the reasons we get diverted. So the term utopia sounds nice to many people. Or some say, well, look, he's a great idealist. You might think about this. It's been said that the ideal is the enemy of the real. Because the ideal is what the human mind conjures up as what the human mind thinks ought to be. He is the utopianist. And this, of course, raises other questions. The nature of evil itself, because the word evil to many people conjures up things that are nasty, unpleasant. The most dangerous evil in the world is presented in a very pleasant shape. Many of its advocates are very pleasant people as people. You've all met that person we call right down at your local community level, we call the do-gooder. Now, the do-gooder only wants to do good to you, whether you want it done to you or not. And then the next step is very logical. So I can do this good to you, I only want enough power. In other words, we're going to use Caesar to do it to you. And as we're going to see in a few minutes, that has far-reaching consequences. In fact, explosive. So this question of words, you can see, is rather important as we come back and ask this question, what is truth? So Muggeridge's great liberal death wish puts this very clearly. In essence, it is between those who accept proper authority and those who don't accept proper authority. Now, the word authority today is one that, again, because of propaganda, conjures up a picture in the minds of many people of something repressive and restrictive and reactionary. I've been just lecturing throughout New Zealand, meeting up with bunches of manipulated kids that are crying their heads off about fascism and so on without understanding what they're talking about, or freedom, or rights. But they've rejected authority. Well, I'll have to explain that when I was a small boy, a very snotty-nosed little kid, I couldn't even play marbles without accepting authority, the authority of the rules. And we all had to agree to accept the rules. We all had to agree that we'd be penalized if we broke the rules. Authority. And as Muggeridge puts it, the ultimate authority, of course, is God. And once we reject the authority of God, we don't have freedom, we have anarchy. These are matters you've got to think about. And as Christians, you've got to equip yourself to be able to argue these points. That if you don't have an orderly society, you have a disorderly society, then there can be no freedom at all. Even down to elementary matters like driving on the roads. If we all said, well, look, I find those road laws very repressive. I think driving on the left-hand side is ridiculous. We ought to drive where we like. Well, of course, you wouldn't have freedom at all. You'd have even greater carnage than you got now. So we come back to that beautiful statement from a Christian point of view, in whose service is perfect freedom. It's through service to the ultimate authority of God and God's laws that we obtain freedom. So you see, this thing called philosophy is important, isn't it? That's the starting point. What men believe governs what they do. And please may I stress, you've got to get it completely correct, because we were told you don't get figs from thistles. You get thistles from thistles. That being the case, how can you get true policies from untrue philosophy? I well recall many years ago, as a member of the Melbourne Anglican Synod, I put up a motion which caused a great sensation this day, that the Synod should go on record as stressing that the philosophy of Christianity, the undergirding philosophy, and that of Marxism or communism were completely incompatible. And therefore we should proceed from that basis and equip ourselves to defeat what was completely evil. And I'm sorry to tell you, in the great debate that took place, we found that at least half the clergy felt that you could, if you couldn't get figs from thistles, perhaps you might get half figs. You see, there was some good in communism. Now, that's the confusion you got today. The philosophy of communism is completely, and I merely state that, against that of Christianity. Now, what is the undergirding philosophy, the point of view about the Christian revelation? It's very simple to me. Christ did not come to say, as Jeremy Lee put it, to save systems. He insisted they all exist to serve the individual. Didn't say anything about saving nations, saving groups. The whole thrust was on the individual. Every individual counted. Every individual was a unique person, unlike every other person. That, to me, is one of the most amazing things in the world, if you'll think about it. Everyone is different. And that, of course, raised another controversial question about equality. A lady at my meeting last Monday night in Christchurch, who I'm quite sure believed she was a Christian, was quite outraged when I said I didn't believe in equality. The real meaning of the word equality is no quality at all. We're all reduced to the one dead level. There's only one sphere of human activity I know where you can claim complete pure equality, and that's in the field of pure mathematics. Because not one of you here today is equal to anyone else. You're all different. And Christ's message was to the differences, that we were unique, and everyone could come to know the Father through the Son. Each individual will be governed and judged as an individual. That is why this dreadful talk about group responsibilities are so evil. It's only individuals can be held responsible. Now, that's got awesome responsibilities attached to it, as we'll see. Right down to how you use your vote. We'll be coming back to that. But on the other hand, what a tremendous concept that each one of us can come to know God, love God, and serve God, and our uniqueness can be developed if we've got that concept. But we've got to create the right social, economic, and other structures so that can be done. I think we can leave that. If you've got any questions, we can come back. But that's the starting point. What is truth? Now, the whole of history can be written around basically 2 points of view concerning what I'm now going to discuss called power. There's only 2, and you've got to make up your mind what is your philosophy about that. Now, you've got the point of view which says if we can only concentrate power sufficiently into the hands of an elite of some sort, they in their great wisdom can solve all the problems of mankind. They can, in fact, create a perfect society, overlooking the fact that in the meantime we haven't yet seen any perfect human beings. But nevertheless, that's the point of view. The other point of view is that the only safe place for power is decentralized power right back to the individual. Now, at this stage, many people say to me, well, aren't you getting a little ahead of yourself, Mr. Butler? Before we discuss power, don't you think we should discuss freedom? We can't discuss freedom without power. If you have no power to make any decisions about anything, you have no freedom. Freedom is dependent upon what power or what sovereignty, what self-government you possess. If you don't have that, you have no freedom. You can't make any decisions about anything. So this is the fundamental question we've got to get quite clear. Now, historically, of course, the Christian approach is quite simple. There's no argument about it. It goes back to that incident which Jeremy Lee just briefly touched upon, the temptation on the mount in the wilderness. Now, the temptation there, and the Gospel of St. Matthew, I think, gives you the best description of it, where Christ was taken up on that high mountain and shown the whole world. And there was the temptation. The temptation was, with complete world power, you could remake the world. That was the way to the new world. And Christ rejected that. And Christ said, in essence, the only place for power was with the individual. The kingdom of God was within each individual. And we've forgotten to a great extent that over 2,000 years of Christian endeavour, there's been an attempt, particularly in the English-speaking world, to implement that teaching. Jeremy Lee touched on Magna Carta. We've forgotten the message of Magna Carta. It concerned this thing called power. There were the 2 points of view. We had Caesar in the shape of King John. We had the barons, and I would put it to you, much more representative than our party political hacks of today are representing anybody except themselves. But the other group at Magna Carta are generally overlooked. And they were the spokesmen for the church, headed by the great Archbishop Stephen Langton. And who did they claim to speak for? They claimed to speak on the authority of God. And in essence, they said to Caesar, now listen, Caesar, as of course Christ had said, we need Caesar, as we're going to see. We've got to, in orderly society, have government. But we don't want so much Caesar, there's nothing left to render unto God. So there is a higher law, said the bishops. And you, Caesar, must obey that higher law along with everybody else. Here was the struggle, the fundamental cleavage. And that is why Magna Carta, which of course is not taught these days, some kids even think it might be an obscure racehorse if you mention it. They've never heard about it. One of the most tremendous documents, a great Christian document restating what regretfully today we've forgotten. What I'm putting to you, we better start to relearn those tremendous lessons if we're going to come out of this difficult period which Jeremy Lee explained we're going into. Power and authority. We had to accept the authority of God. All flowed from there. Caesar in his correct place, division of power. The individual had fundamental rights which he didn't obtain from the state. You see, many people tell me, well, look, the Soviet Union's got a nice sounding constitution. It lays down all the rights of the individual. And you ask, well, where do you get those rights from? From the state. Well, what the state grants, the state can take away. But as you all know, God's rights, God's freedoms He's given to us are quite free. A completely different type of authority. Now, over history, we can see how this works out. We come to the test. By their fruits ye shall know them. You know, there is tremendous wisdom in the New Testament. Tremendous wisdom, if we just look at it. By their fruits, not by what they say, not by what they promise. What are their fruits? If the fruits are bitter, well then the philosophy's wrong. As I say, if you're getting thistles, you're obviously growing thistles, not growing figs. That is the acid test. And it's most important we keep, to use a colloquialism, our eye on the ball as we come to look at this a little further. Now, throughout history, the two policies from the two philosophies. Let's have a look at the one where you centralize power. Now, this produces something which has been summarized in a law. You've probably all heard it. Let's repeat it. The great law concerning power, enunciated by the great Christian historian and philosopher, Lord Acton. And I might just remind you, as I remind my Roman Catholic friends, this statement was made in a letter to his friend Lord Crichton when he was, as a devout Catholic, objecting to the doctrine of infallibility concerning the Holy Father. It's important to bear this in mind. This law, as Acton said, applies to everybody. And the law was, all power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Now that law, tested over history, is just as absolute as the law of gravity. You can, if you're a liberal-minded person, say, well, look, I don't like that law. It ought not to be like that. And you've got freedom to fight if you like. Like the individual, he can keep jumping over the cliff if he likes and say, well, look, I just reject this law of gravity. Well, he'll find every time he jumps, he'll hit the ground. And as the great G.K. Chesterton said, very witty, most poets seem to have a greater insight, the man that jumps over the cliff not only violates the law of gravity, but he demonstrates the truth of it. Do you know that's what we're doing today in our civilization? The plight of the world is demonstrating the truth of God's universe. We're demonstrating it every day. It's just a question of when we wake up and say, well, look, it's rather silly to keep on jumping over the cliff. But some people are not very bright, particularly those who are convinced, well, perhaps we just haven't got enough power yet. If we only had a bit more. So as Acton said, they become corrupted. And he said that applies to everybody, and I don't care who he is. It's rather interesting, you know, if you talk to politicians, particularly party politicians, I generally find when they're in opposition they agree with this law. And they'll tell you, well, yes, of course, it's true. Yes, that bunch of so they've been in office far too long. They're quite corrupted. But if only we had the power, think of the good we could do with it. But it applies to all of us. It applies to all of us, and I could give you some quite devastating examples of individuals who set out with this liberal view, just wanted a little bit of power, going to do good with it, and the further they went, the more corrupt they became. Now, there's one aspect of this corruption that's generally overlooked. Many people can see that it corrupts the person who's using the power. Becomes more and more arrogant, self-willed, and full of his own importance, becomes God. But there's another aspect. It corrupts those over whom the power is used. You see, if you are governed by someone else, you don't make any decisions yourself, you then are being corrupted. I hope I don't upset anyone. The traditional Christian objection to drunkenness has not been on health grounds, because without giving you a lecture on that subject, we do a lot more dangerous things to our bodies with some of the rubbish we eat than consuming alcohol. The traditional objection was the drunkard surrenders control of himself, control of purpose. That's what we're doing today. If we keep surrendering our lives to Caesar, Big Brother, or someone else, you're being corrupted. Until eventually you may even reach that dreadful state, and that must be the most dreadful of all, as the writer put it, the slave can come to love his chains. What a dreadful level that must be. So the law of power and corruption is an absolute. It's as absolute as the law of gravity, any other laws you care to define. Yes, it takes a while to work out. And that is why the question of history is so important. Real history. I've given a little story, it's rather humorous perhaps on this, of the lecturer, full of his own importance, real liberal, rejected all authority, on the blackboard was going to prove to the students the law of gravity was nonsense. That fellow that discovered it, you know, the apple fell on his head, and all those people, they're just a lot of nonsense. I'm going to prove it. And then he said, much to their astonishment, I'm going to now demonstrate. So up he went onto the 50th floor. The students were all waiting and he jumped off. And as he went past the 40th floor, he waved to them all and he said, "Quite all right." And he was at that point, but he wasn't a couple of minutes later. You've all heard the statement of the mills of God grind slowly, but they do grind. So sometimes it's like if you violate how you should treat your body, it may take a while before it catches up with you. But eventually it does, but it takes time. That is why these tremendous principles, truths, have got to be discussed in a time context. And that is why the church, which Jeremy Lee referred to, should be a body of authority on such matters. It's one of the reasons it should never have vacated, for example, the field of education to Caesar. That's one of the results of the abdication everywhere. These are questions I think we've got to give a lot of thought to. So you can take either course, centralised power with all the corruption, more and more compulsion, more and more tyrannical government, until eventually you get complete dissatisfaction, or the other policy, rooted in the other philosophy, that's the individual that counts. Therefore, we build from there. Caesar exists to serve the individual. Institutions exist to serve the individual. The group exists to serve the individual. And now we associate not under compulsion, but under the great Christian law of love. And I would agree with, again, Jeremy Lee, that statement concerning love. It's not one of those silly sentimental things like you read in all these novels today. It is a brilliant truth. It works. It works when you apply it. Any group that's come together through voluntary association because the individuals are attracted towards achieving something they couldn't get on their own, that is a tremendous success. There's harmony. The other policy produces disaster. Now, just one final point on this, because it's associated with our contemporary world, where instead of using words, as Bacon put it, to get a just relationship between the mind and things, we now throw words at people like slogans. You're a fascist, you're a Nazi, you're an extremist, you're a racist. These are all slogans. This obscures reality. But as I said, you don't change reality by putting different words on it. Many years ago in America, back in the Great Depression of the 30s, there was a famous demagogue. He was assassinated, a chap called Huey Long. I merely give it this because as a young man I was most struck by this. And Long predicted the day would come when America would go under fascism. But he said they won't call it fascism. They'll call it democracy. You see, the Soviet Union, if you believe the words, is the most advanced democracy in the world. It must be. It says so. It's the people's democracy. Let me give you another analogy, what I'm trying to get across. In my part of the world, where we have a few fox problems, at lambing time, we use poison, we use strychnine for poisoning. And the form in which we obtain it is pinkish powder. It rather looks like icing sugar. Now, supposing you put that in a bottle and you label it icing sugar, it looked like icing sugar. But I can assure you, if you had a teaspoon of it, the label wouldn't help you one bit. You don't change reality by putting a different label on it. Many people were astonished after the Second World War in East Germany, when large numbers of Nazi officials became communist officials. There was no difference. All they had to do was change the label. the reality was just the same. They were motivated by the same philosophy. The Hitler movement recruited a large number of its supporters from communists. The fascists in Italy, Mussolini was a Marxist one time. That's important, that you don't change reality by putting a different label on it. It's the reality itself we've got to look at. And therefore, to conclude this little part of the lecture, I don't care what the label you put on government. The more it centralises power, the greater the corruption. The more you take from the individual that which belongs to God. The more you corrupt him, the more you produce dissatisfaction in society. It takes a while sometimes to work out. Some of you would recall the great battles about the British entry into the common market. Again, all the idealists, but behind them were the hard-nosed people, the idealists said this is a marvellous vision. It should work. It ought to work. Look at the coming togetherness and all the rest. There were those who said, as I was one of them I recall, who said, but look, you can't get figs from thistles. The end result must be disastrous. 20 years later, if you had a vote in Britain today, 80% would say we've had enough of it. It's taken them 80 years to realise you don't get figs from thistles. They turned their back on their own traditions, the undergirding philosophy of Christianity, which gave rise to their political system, and much else. And I would direct your attention on this question. It's most important. A little book called Foundations of Liberty by the Reverend, these days, Canon Arthur Fellows, who examines this historically from a Christian viewpoint. Christians, may I stress, must concern themselves with real history. If we don't know how we've come to where we are, if we don't know of the great successes we've achieved, then how do we know where we're going? What have we got to offer the next generation that are so tormented at the moment of where they're going, cut off from their roots? This is absolutely essential for those of you who are going to play any effective role in the battle that's taking place in the world today. Well, now, if we can see this, the next point is very simple. The real argument for what we call democracy is the decentralisation of power, where individuals freely are making decisions about their own affairs. And to take it from there, the realities of the world are such that we have discovered principles. These truths, which, as I said, transcend human thinking, and when we apply them, they work. And it's amazing how often we do work them without realising we're working them. Now, let's take a little simple analogy. Supposing we're a group of people, if you can be imaginative for a while, imagine you're like little children again. We've all thought up games and imagined things. Let's imagine we're a maroon group of people on one of those idyllic Pacific islands, and we're all living happy ever afterwards. And after a period, we decide, well, apart from eating and drinking and all the things that go with the material things of life, we'd like to do other things. We'd like to play some game. So we decide, well, now what could we play? We're different sexes, different ages. So someone says a lot about golf. I remember we used to play golf. All right. Now, the important thing is, before we can play golf, we've got to do something. We've got to form a golf club. You see, we've got to form an association so we as individuals can get what we call a profit, or the increment of association. You see, that's another part of the truth of this universe. So the next thing we do is we decide, all right, we're going to form a golf club so we can play golf. The next thing is we've got to have something called a constitution. And a constitution can be either written or unwritten, but it lays down the rules. And we all agree to subscribe to the rules. How we're going to elect the committee and how you're going to run the club and so on. So we elect the committee, and then taking our minds ahead, they decide, all right, we've got to get the facilities for playing golf, so you've got to get bulldozers in if you had the equivalent, clear down the bush, and you put down the little putting greens in that little hole, which I generally find are far too small myself. And then it's got a social side, so you've got to have a golf club house, and when it's all ready, we can all then go and play golf. Now please note there's no nonsense, all golfers are equal, because I can assure you they're definitely unequal. I'm one of the most unequal ones of all. But note the beauty of the association inside a framework of principle. Each individual can play the game in accordance with his attributes or his interest. If you think you're a budding Gary player, you can go down and put in all the time you like, or if you're just a housewife that like a few social afternoons with the rest of the girls, or if you're a businessman that just wants to chat over a business deal, you can all play. Everybody's satisfied. Now, of course, the game itself's got some rules. They're very simple. In fact, there's only, I think, 7 words. The ball shall be played where it lays. I'll tell you, those 7 words have caused a lot of trouble, a lot of people. You see, and then on top of that, there's something called an ethic. It used to apply to cricket, but cricket, like everything else, has been reduced to a lower level. We used to talk about it's not cricket. That's the spirit. Sportsmanship. The Anglo-Saxon used to pride himself on that once. So in the case of golf, you know, if the ball's in the rough when your opponent's not looking, you don't give it a little kick. And if everybody plays within that, we all get satisfaction. The good player, the bad player, the indifferent player. It works. That is the type of association which reflects reality, serves the individual. Well, now to hasten along, let us imagine one day a group of officials are taken to one of those special courses they have these days in universities where they study something called sociology. And there they're convinced this game of golf is very reactionary. It's really quite bad for people. In fact, it's been proved in the higher scientific circles it produces traumas. You've heard of all those things that sociologists preach, you know, about parents that smack their children, all these dreadful things. And really, it's your duty now with this higher knowledge to go back and stop that game immediately. In fact, to tell them it's been proved conclusively that baseball's far superior. It does a lot of things for everybody. Now, you imagine if the group come back and said, now, with this higher knowledge, we know what's good for you. So it's golf out and baseball in. Well, I suppose the first reaction would be, well, let's have a look at the Constitution. What's the special provision in the Constitution to call an urgent meeting and vote these idiots out? Well, supposing it's difficult to vote them out, the other thing you could do, if you've got freedom of choice, you just pick up your golf clubs and you say, well, cheerio. And all the members leave the club, and the club no longer serves them, so there's no longer the necessity for a club. Now, if you can quickly transport yourselves from there to, shall we say, a society like the Soviet Union, you can see where what we're talking about works out. Because there, those that have got the power have decided, because societies we're going to see is just simply a complex association of human beings, they've all got to play the equivalent of baseball in the Soviet Union. They can't change the committee because the committee's got all the guns, and they can't pick up the equivalent of their clubs and leave because there's an iron curtain. They've got to stay and play baseball or the equivalent whether they want to or not, and people that are compelled to do things they don't want to do don't do it very well. Now, if you'll grasp those correct principles of association, we can now come to the final stage of this lecture, where what we call our society is only a complex association, where over history individuals have learned how to come together to achieve in association what they couldn't get as individuals. It's fascinating, you know, to study the growth of civilization. You go back first to the simple tribes. They had to keep shifting the crop of the herd, at least their animals. You'll recall the biblical and other stories, to where the food was. But then in the Middle East, the Euphrates Valley, the Nile Valley, a great discovery was made. Crops could be grown in the one place. Grown because it was discovered that God's universe is an abundant universe. Have you ever thought about the Lord's Prayer where we're asked, give us this day our daily bread? Surely Christ didn't ask us to pray for our daily bread or the equivalent, the material things of life, if the Father hadn't provided an abundance. He has. The problem, as Jeremy Lee said about the world, is not a world of scarcity. It's not a mean, miserable world. It's a world overflowing not only with God's love, but his abundance. And they discovered it. And as they discovered the abundance, and again, let us make this point. The discovery of truth, Jeremy Lee touched on that, because it's important to remember there's another God being elevated by the liberals and the market called science. What science has done, ladies and gentlemen, science is merely the discovery of what was. Man doesn't create, man discovers. That gives a new relevance to that saying of seek the truth, and the truth shall make you free. And the more truth we discover, the greater we can expand the physical basis of freedom. It's fascinating, you know, that even the terms we use can be misleading, such as the generation of electricity, as if we've created something. All we've done is change that which has already existed. But we've discovered truth, and so as we discovered more and more truth, the old question of poverty was slowly but surely shifted. More free time was available. So the individual could spiritualize himself. The arts, the crafts, all started to flourish. Which gives a new dimension, doesn't it, to God's universe. The whole subject of what is the true purpose of the production system? Does it exist to serve the individual, or, as the communists say, to control the individual? Well, the Christian's got to have an answer. He's got to have an answer on what is called unemployment. Is it a curse, or is it a manifestation of discovering so many of God's truths that fewer people in the production system provide an abundance for all? Doesn't that mean then, under proper conditions, every individual who's God's child's got a right to live with dignity, and God's made it available? And it all comes back to understanding these principles. So then we reach the stage with a developed society. First of all, we got, in the middle, we got economics. Well, we've discovered that private property is linked with that philosophy of decentralized power. The ownership of something is essential for each individual to develop himself. Even if it's his own little cottage, which he can paint in his own way, decorate in his own way. It may be very humble, but it belongs to that little family, and through it, they develop themselves. You see, the test of any concept is, does it work again? And without going into it in this lecture, communism as a system's a complete failure because it's contrary to truth. It's often overlooked. The first communists, in the economic sense, in the North American continent were the Pilgrim Fathers. I like to tell Americans this one. And they're amazed. Do you know they tried economic communism? And they nearly came to complete disaster in spite of the fact they were God-fearing and Christian. But human nature is such. The man that had no family said, why should I work as hard as that character there that's got 8 children? They nearly came to disaster. And they had to then go back to a system of private property. Each individual personally responsible for that which he was going to operate. Then they started to flourish. And it doesn't matter what the property may be. It's not property as such which corrupts, it's the misuse of it. Private property. Then, if we accept what works, the consumer has got to control it. Well, we have something called the money vote. We'll be having a look at that. And money is a vote. Now, there's no argument the free enterprise system of economics has provided access to God's abundance on a scale that just dwarfs the imagination. The bread of life aspect's been solved. But, we were told, man does not live by bread alone. He's got to have more than bread, all right? So he's got to have freedom. But before he can do that in society, he's a social animal, he's got to live together. Like our golf club, so he's got to have government. That's all government is, equivalent of the golf club committee. Then you've got to have a constitution to govern it, because the reality of history has taught us that governments, once they get a little power, want more power. So the Christians got to have a view on this. And our Christian forebears did have those views because they were taught. They needed Caesar, but not too much of him. And it's rather, to me, interesting that in the English world we built up that Trinitarian concept of government. That's, to me, fascinating. The House of Commons, the lower house, then an upper house to check, divide the power, and originally the House of Lords was both Lords temporal and Lords spiritual. And you may be amazed to know this, that up until 1917, Christianity was accepted as part of the unwritten Constitution of England. It was then abolished as part of the new Enlightenment. And on top of that, we've got that other part of our constitutional system called the constitutional monarchy. And again, it's a great tragedy that few can put forward a case for the retention of monarchy, its Christian background, and the role it should play in the type of government that's Christian. Along with this, we have, as Jeremy Lee said, the independent judiciary. Government should be responsible for defence, but government should be confined to merely, as with the golf club, seeing the rules governing the club are maintained with the maximum freedom for individuals inside the club to get on with the game of life. So over here, that's where the real game of life is played. The third division, the cultural or spiritual. That's where the great advances have been. You see, all true progress is moral progress. All true progress is moral progress. It doesn't tell us much to say we've invented a plane now that cuts 4 hours off flying from here to New York. The question is, what do we do with the 4 hours we've saved? That's the question. Do we spiritualize our lives more with this free time? Or do we merely have the free time years to put us to do some more material activity under the control of someone's got the power to do it? Sporting activities, the arts, service to one another, through the Boy Scouts, Girl Guides, all of this is where the real progress of man's taken place. It's a vast subject. Look at the subject, for example, of the arts. Isn't this where all the real progress has been made, coming from individuals? Can anybody imagine a government department writing the plays of Shakespeare? Or perhaps the great paintings of Michelangelo? These are all the flowering of individuals. Spirituality pouring out. And the tragedy is there's so much of it today that's still potential, it's crushed. Even sport itself reduced to the level of paid gladiators. You've all seen this. And to conclude, then, ladies and gentlemen, if we had a truly Christian society, that is one that reflects truth, that is the philosophy of truth, decentralized power, it would be one in which economics and politics would be kept to their true place, which is to serve the individual, so in that third aspect of his affairs he can get on with the real game of life, motivated by that Christian teaching of love. And I agree with what Jeremy Lee says. To have that vision requires not a mechanic, detailed blueprint of how you're all going to live, but a tremendous faith in a tremendous adventure.
Some people really don't know how to produce anything, so they don't have much credit. Others have great capacity. So let's forget about financial credit and look at real credit. And I've put there real credit equals productive capacity. That's the capacity of those people to produce the things that they want. And that is made up of a number of different things, which I've listed under various headings, as you can see. And the first thing is, before any group of people, before any nation can produce anything, they've got to have something to start with. You couldn't go right out into the middle of space and start producing things, because all you've got around you is space. So I've listed under heading 1 the simplest, most basic things that any of us could think of. Earth, the source of our food. It transforms seeds into life, plants. In fact, really, it's the bed of all production, if you like. Air that we breathe. Without air, of course, we couldn't live. Water, which again is absolutely essential to life. We don't last too long without water. Minerals that we shape into the various tools that we use. And solar energy. And solar energy in a wider sense than just sunbeams. Sunbeams is the start, but sunbeams are then locked into various types of energy, like, for example, petroleum or coal, all of which really is trapped sunbeams. We call it solar energy. Locked into fossil fuels, just trapped in there, and then mankind can use it. And you look at that list first of all, and you just look along it, and you'd have to ask the question, how much of that was created by man? Quite obviously none of it. Who created it then? Well, Christians don't even have to think about that. They know very well this was created by God and was given to man. Now, this sounds absolutely trite, doesn't it? Most people know that. Little children would know this. And yet, do you know that once you've accepted that, you have taken a giant stride away from every type of economic teaching in any university in the world at the present time? Because every university teaches that labor produces all wealth. And we have what is called the labor theory of value. The labor theory of value is taken as a divine principle in the law of economics. Labor produces all wealth. Well, how much of that was produced by labor? None of it. It was produced and created by God and given to man for nothing. We didn't have to pay hire purchase to get that. We didn't have to go and sign a contract. We were given a huge area of wealth for nothing, which strikes a second deadly blow at economics taught around the world, which is that you never get anything for nothing. Well, we started off pretty well. God gave us a vast area of capital, physical capital, to his children and said, this is for you. You are to take dominion over that. You're to use it properly, husband it. That's where we get the word husbandry from. And for a long time, man lived in an environment that had all these things that God had given us, and we didn't really know how to use it. So our economic systems were the most primitive things. You can read it in the Old Testament. Simple tribes that just herded cattle on hillsides. You can still see many nations in the world that live at that level of economy. Subsistence. Sometimes they eat berries out of the forest, shoot an animal. Their whole economic system, their productive system, is a terrific struggle just to extract life out of what God has given us. But you see, inherent in what God had given us was also this thing which we've developed in the previous lectures, that if you discover truth, it makes life better for you. And man began to discover ways to use this beautiful capital that God had given us. He discovered something called a wheel. Now, he didn't really invent it. He merely discovered a natural law that was there. Wheels turn, they're round, you can shift things with them. You can even ride on them. And as soon as he discovered that wheel, his real credit grew a little bit. He discovered something called a lever. You can get a lever and put it over a fulcrum, and you can get on the end and you can shift a weight you couldn't shift with your muscles. Now, he didn't actually create the lever. He simply discovered that by putting two things together, you'd stumbled on part of God's law, and it made things easier. And he began to bank this knowledge of how to use the environment into his mind and then to pass it on to his children. You see, once the wheel had been discovered, we didn't have to keep discovering it every generation. Fathers told sons, and sons had that knowledge for nothing. So as God gave people something for nothing, we in turn, having discovered how to use this, then passed it on to our children for nothing. We had a mechanism to do this, which we call our educational system. And the educational system is supposed to be a mechanism to keep passing on to those who come after us what we have learnt about the environment that God has given us. Not just in production, but in every sphere of human activity. And this bank of knowledge that we've got, we call our cultural heritage. The Americans call it know-how, which perhaps is more graphic. You just keep passing your know-how on, and each generation gets something for nothing. Now, it's quite possible for a generation to come along which says, this cultural heritage, you know, is just a waste of time. Why bother to pick it up? Why bother to learn it? And you can have a bank of knowledge which has taken 1,000 years to build up, destroyed in one generation. And what happens to that civilization? They go right back to square one, and it might take them another 1,000 years to build up the same cultural heritage that the previous civilization might have had. You lose the whole thing just by disobedience or neglect or pride. But provided you use the cultural heritage which you've been given correctly, how to use what God has given us, certainly in a productive sense, it enables a number of great benefits or increments to come flowing through. And in a productive sense, every time we discover a way of making advances, doing things easier, learning how to use our environment, we can translate that into one of two fields. Either we can continue to increase production, or else, as we've discovered a way to make it easier, we can have more leisure. We can have our Sundays off. Don't have to work on those days. You could even have Saturday afternoons off. And I would put it to you, again, right against everything that is taught, that what we call the greatest progress, if we're going to use that word civilization, comes out of leisure and not out of work. I'm really challenging a few sacred cows, no doubt. People say leisure instead of work. Well, you can test it. Go and have a look at societies that have no leisure at all. They're the most brutalized type of societies that you'll ever find. You can think of a number of examples. I spent nearly all my life in Africa, and you can see many people there who have no leisure. I can think of one tribe in the Kalahari Desert. They'd be the hardest working people on earth. Their economic system simply evolves around getting up as the sun comes up, going off hunting, perhaps going 30, 40 miles. If they're very lucky, they find an animal, shoot it, drag it back home, absolutely exhausted, put it in a cooking pot, eat it, and that gives them the strength the next day to get up and do the same thing. And if you don't do it, you go hungry. So they are absolutely like on a treadmill, if you like, just to keep going. And there is a society without any music, without any art, without any history, without any dream time, without any culture, without pictures, without faith. And they could be like that for another 1,000 years, until they simply discover one little new facet about their God's creation which might break them out. Perhaps just a new weapon to shoot that animal, I don't know. Perhaps the fact that you can plant seeds in the ground and make it grow into food. You can go and have a look at communist societies. The one thing the communist society says is no leisure. Full employment for everybody, 7 days a week, including wives. And one of the most remarkable things, that people come back from a trip through Russia and they say 11 o'clock at night you see old women running concrete machines and sweeping the streets. There's a brutalized society. But as against that, go back into periods in our own history as we developed a very dim understanding of how to use our environment in a Christian way. And one of the most interesting periods is right back in the 1200s, the same period that produced Magna Carta, when although they'd never heard of motor cars and televisions and all the gadgets that clutter up our society today, for what they needed, they had a good productive system. Their food, their clothing, their shelter, their simple needs. And the result of this was that the average family in England, and not only England, but really right through parts of Europe, between 12 and 1300 were working 16 weeks of the year. 16 weeks of the year. And here we are arguing about a 35-hour week as though the end of the world had come. The church, which was very strong, decreed 150 holidays a year. 150 holidays a year. They were called holy days. That's where the word came from. And there was a special saint for each day. And you go through the old church calendars and look at the saints' days, you'd have a job remembering how many there were. And on those days you didn't work. Well, what on earth did people do with 150 holidays a year? Did they all go down to the pub and get absolutely blind drunk, or on drugs, or get on motorbikes and go screeching around the streets? Or they translated that enormous leisure period into the greatest explosion of culture. They spiritualized their lives that we've probably ever seen. It's about the last asset that Britain has got left. In a period of 97 years, they built 48 of the most beautiful cathedrals that mankind has ever seen. And they were built in spare time as a leisure activity. And you go into cathedrals like Westminster Abbey or Canterbury Cathedral, Exeter, Wells, Norwich, right up and down the length and land of Britain. You walk into buildings that are out of this world. 600 or 700 feet long, 300 feet tall, and the thing that hits you is the almost excruciating amount of detail and care and love that went into building those. Minute carvings. We couldn't do it today. There's not one machine, there's not one engineer, there's not one architect could even approach it. All done with simple hand tools. First one that was ever built was Notre Dame Cathedral in France. They had 2,500 volunteers working on that cathedral every day for 80 years. How's that? And you come outside and you see scratched into the old stonework to the greater glory of God. There were no strikes, no overtime, no bosses, no union officials, none of the nonsense that we've got today. People just got together after the food and the housekeeping and the living side of life was concerned and said, well, what are we going to do? Let's build the most beautiful thing we can do up on the hill there. And away they'd go for 80 years. There wasn't only in the field of the church. There are cottages. Many of them are standing today. When you built a home there, you didn't build it for 60 years, you built it for 800. Little cottages right up and down Britain. Those marvelous villages, guild halls, where they used to hold their civic functions, their markets. Nearly everybody plays a musical instrument. You're an absolute non if you didn't play something or other. Terrific amount of drama. There was really no barrier between the church and the state. If you had a great problem in your village, you took it into the church. And people used to sit around in the church and discuss philosophical questions and political questions and how should we run the nation. And that's how Magna Carta really was a Christian document. It was the product really of the church, even though it applied to the state. And people call that period Merry England. Merry England. There's a nice ring about that. And it flowed through to the 1400s and the 1500s, and it began to throw up individuals who had a tremendous personal development of genius, which comes out of a type of field that is nurtured in a certain type of way. People like Shakespeare and Bacon, the father of deductive science. And then gradually men lost the vision. The next great discovery, under heading 3 there, was something called the division of labor. Now, up until that time, everything had been done on a very simple cottage industry basis. One man was a thatcher. He thatched roofs on cottages. One man was a man who put shoes on horses. One man was a clothier and made coats out of... Everything was done on an individual, simple cottage industry basis. One man was the baker who made homemade loaves. One man might make nails for building, and they had very primitive nails, and he used to sit down in his village with a little forge in front of him, and he'd draw bars of iron into the right length with a hammer and a forge, and then he'd put a point on one end and a flathead on the other end and pack them into little baskets. And working under that system day after day, he might produce 50 nails a day. And then he discovered that if you sat 4 people down in a line, and each person took part of the process. One heated the iron, the next one put the points on, the next man put the flatheads on, the next man packed them into their little rush baskets, that without any extra effort, production now increased to 150 nails per person instead of 50. There was a new extra bonus that came without effort simply by discovering correct principles. And that was the forerunner of huge industrial lines that really have taken it too far today. Well, you might see a car going right through a factory, and each person just does one thing. You just spend your life putting a bolt on, or a steering wheel on, or painting it, or whatever. And because that endless belt is so long and there are so many things coming off it, they all begin to look exactly the same. I think the first one that really hit the world was Henry Ford and his Model T car that came, I think a million came off an endless belt back in 1916. So many of them, and that Henry Ford coined that famous phrase that if you wanted a Model T Ford, you could have any color you wanted so long as it was black. But really, if you think about it, that discovery should have knocked that 16 weeks of the year down to 13 weeks of the year, or perhaps 12. And then all of a sudden man discovered the most incredible thing of all, this strange thing called the machine. And here was a means, this strange thing, whether it was a steam engine or electricity or a 1 horsepower motor or whatever, of translating solar energy straight into production without human muscles being involved at all. This 1 horsepower motor would do the work of 10 men with wages, sweat, blood, tears, toil, tiredness, for a few pence a week in the form of energy. And you just imagine standing in the Industrial Revolution as the first machines that mankind had ever known came into existence, and looking forward into the future and trying to dream what society is going to come out of this. Is the day actually coming in the future when we're going to have, instead of men walking around a paddock behind a horse and a plow, we're actually going to have a machine that plants the wheat and harvests it? People would have said, that's mad. Don't be ridiculous. I saw the figures for the United States the other day. They got all their wheat harvesters into one paddock. They could harvest the whole state of Iowa, which is 56,000 square miles, in a fraction under 24 hours. Staggering. Is the day coming when man no longer has to crawl down a hole in the ground with a pick and a shovel on his back and a bag with a lamplight to hack out a few minerals, put it in his bag and crawl his way up to the surface? We're actually going to have machines mining our minerals for us. Go and have a look at that Rundle thing they're developing in Queensland. We're going to bring into Australia, this is an awful thought, 3 machines that are so big that each machine wouldn't even sit on a football pitch. It has legs on it which are like massive, great 10-foot elephant trunks. And to pick one leg up, move it forward, put it down again, takes 44 gallons of fuel. Complete drum. And the bucket on the end of the arm, which just digs into the soil, you could put the whole Sydney Symphony Orchestra sitting in that bucket playing away at their instruments. And we're going to have 3 of those gulping away 24 hours a day. Is the day coming when we're actually going to see horses traveling along the roads without carriages pulling them? What's the biggest problem? Where to park the wretched things today. Isn't it? And then the most incredible question of all, is the day coming when man no longer really has to work? We need fewer and fewer people to produce the things that are needed. That we're moving into an age when that dreadful punishment of the Garden of Eden, by the sweat of your brow, a punishment from God, is going to be lifted off the backs of men. And then the most incredible question of all, is the day coming when man no longer really has to work? We need fewer and fewer people to produce the things that are needed. That we're moving into an age when that dreadful punishment of the Garden of Eden, by the sweat of your brow, a punishment from God, is going to be lifted off the backs of men. And that terrified the world, that thought. And instead of facing up to what was happening, when you think about it, the machine did the very opposite. The first machines that were built, instead of liberating people, were actually put into the cotton mills of Lancashire. And as the machines came in one side of the factory, the door at the other end opened and people just got the sack. They weren't needed. And they stumbled out into a new world where production was increasing and more people were starving because they hadn't got jobs. What we're talking about now, this huge unemployment, we've been smothering up for 200 years, you know. It's not something new. It's just got more and more intense. But it started then. The production of Britain rose and the starvation of Britain increased. Isn't it ridiculous? And workers scratched their heads and said, what's the answer? The answer is, let's get rid of the machine. So they had gangs, went round Britain in the dead of night with huge jackhammers, broke into the factories and tried to smash the machines to pieces. The Luddites. They couldn't hold it up. It was coming in so fast. There was an avalanche of technology. So the next development was much more frightening. There was a little man called Karl Marx sitting in Britain. That's where he was, in the middle of that Industrial Revolution, writing a book in the British Museum called the Communist Manifesto. And if you look at that book, it was written as a response to this new development. And he says it was not the machine that was to blame. It was ownership of the machine. And if we could produce a new scientific world where we got rid of all private property, how could one man exploit his brother? So let us build a revolutionary machine that will sweep the world and all the institutions that have shaped that previous world, including the Christian church. It's got to be broken by violence on the scrap heap of history and a new scientific age of equality put in its place. And you know, if you're starving, and you've got your kids working down, sloshing through the mines underground as they were in that Industrial Revolution. Little kids of 7 and 8, down thousands of feet in the darkness. Or your wives were working 16 hours a day for the price of bread. You know, you listen to anything. And that movement has now taken a third of the world, more than that. But it provides the thinking, the teaching, the learning in our part of the world. At every university, broadly, the economic teaching we're getting is one variety or another of Marxism. Sometimes unconsciously, sometimes quite consciously. But what was the Christian answer? The Christians said to those who were sloshing through the water, this world is a vale of tears. We're not meant to enjoy ourselves, you know. Just think about the world to come. But it's a bit tough to accept that if your kids are starving. And so we just blundered on economically, trying to fit into our economic system 2 totally impossible things. One said more and more and more technology. The second said full employment for everybody, and he who shall not work, neither shall he eat. The Christian was divided on this question himself. And if you're going to try and run an economic system with those 2 totally impossible things in it, You've only got one question to answer. What are you going to do with all the production? And you have to shape a certain type of economic system to keep the thing going, and that is an economic system that produces more and more and more, whether it is required or not. So we launched a technological attack on God's environment, which was really not husbandry at all. It was now destruction. We began to try and keep going by producing more and more and more. You look at technological societies that have played this game harder and longer than any other, and you see the most destructive. Communism is destructive, but look at capitalism. Look at the United States. It had to make economic units that produced more to survive. So in the space of 20 years, they shifted 16 million little farmers off the soil because they were told, now your farms are no longer producing enough. You've got to produce more to keep going. America was built around the Homestead Act, which was a Christian concept. Just a little bit of property for each family. That was gone. So you amalgamated farms together, and then you amalgamated those together again, and finally you produced something called an agri-business, which was run more like a government department than a farm, and you had, on huge, great tracts of land, people with white coats walking around, and you had a department of chooks, and a department of cabbages, and a department of cows, and the whole thing's crashing now because you can't run farms like that, and the little farm is coming back. But what a way to learn. And what happened to 16 million people, that's more than the whole population of Australia, just heaved out of one social economic environment and dumped down in another? Where did they go? They still had to live. They still had to have this thing called a job. So they went to the big cities, and the big cities, instead of being nice places, as they used to be, became awful. And in came a man called Whelan the Wrecker with a ball on the end of a chain, and he began to knock down the little suburban homes, and up in their places went high-rise flats. And you began to pack people into those like chooks into a chook pen. And we're doing this all over Sydney and Melbourne as though it's progress. What a way to bring up kids. You can't keep a puppy, you can't keep a kitten. Most of them you can't even keep a budgerigar. I heard of one not so long ago in Canada they forgot to put stairways in it. All they had were electric lifts. Family after family in tears. And if the power went off or you had a power strike, you were just trapped in your rat hole like a rat in a rat trap. Power went off in one area for 3 days. So they had a helicopter flapping up and down outside this building trying to throw sausages in through the windows. The ones we have in Melbourne and Sydney, we have 4 or 5 social workers now attached to each building simply because of the breakdown of the family in those conditions. Now, it wasn't terribly long ago. We had the Minister for Housing in the Soviet Union and shown round as a privileged guest over one block of flats in Melbourne. He said it was better than anything they had in Russia. And the very day he went round, some poor, wretched woman threw herself off the top of one building and committed suicide. They've had a number. She said, I can't take it any longer. Now, if somehow you can survive living in an environment like that, you come out down into the ant heap down below, and from Monday to Friday, there's a huge race trying to get this thing called a job. And away they go into industry if you're lucky enough to have a job in industry, and in industry there's only one problem: how do we get rid of this mountain of stuff that we're producing? We've got machines now which at the touch of a button can produce in minutes what it took days to produce a few years ago. So we begin to devise totally destructive ways of shifting it. First thing is export it. Export it, export or die. And the whole world is caught up in exports, except for one group, the communists. They say, you send all your exports to us. We don't want to export back at you. We'll just live off your Western production. We've fed them, we've clothed them, we've armed them. We'll put their factories in place. And now we shiver in front of the armies and navies, which we've built for them. Do you know that 4/5 of the ships in the Soviet Navy, which straddles the whole world, has turbines and diesels manufactured in the West? Well, exports can only take us so far. So the next question is, force your own people to consume more. So we devised the most brilliant brainwashing technique in the world called advertising. Instead of being a service telling you what's available, it's now a pressure to make people conform, and it hits you every 5 minutes over your television. We take it now for granted, but just sit and listen to it one day. It's brilliant, you know. Something washes whiter than white. Now, what does that mean when you think about it? All go and live in Marlborough country. And you see great bronzed heroes riding horses across the boundless plains. I think half of them have lung cancer, probably. The other half are being amalgamated and moved off. And then, you see, if that doesn't serve the purpose, and it did for a while, we developed one further technique. The only way we can keep our society going is to start making things that'll break down quicker and quicker. I don't know if you've noticed this. It is a science taught at university now. It's not just haphazard. And if you want to get a picture of this, get a book called The Waste Makers by Vance Paggard. He's a socialist. His conclusion is wrong, but his description of the problem is 100%. He just went through one industry after another in the United States and painted a picture of what was happening. One I can think of, tires on cars. There was a little firm, absolutely broke, desperate, didn't know how to survive, trying to appease the bank manager. They had a board meeting and they said, well, look, let's look at the tires. The tires were lasting 20,000 miles on the average car. Let's make a whole new batch that only lasts 10,000 miles. So they did. And the dreadful thing is, it solved their problem. They sold more tires, you see. Bigger profits, black figures instead of red figures, happy bank manager, everybody smiling, more jobs. And in that microcosm is how we're running the Western world. And so America or Canada today, the main feature are huge areas of slag heaps of motor cars, washing machines, microwave ovens, fridges, nothing's ever repaired, piled, sometimes covering tens of thousands of acres, 4 or 5 deep. And that is, so long as we keep building those, perhaps we can keep the thing going. And even that now is running out. And so now we're finally getting factories where you don't have people working. I saw a picture of one the other day. It was a photograph where the factory was so big you couldn't see the end of it. It was just bank after bank after bank of machines producing shirts. And you went into the office, and there on a board was a program set up, all computerized, and you could work out how many shirts, how many colors, how many sizes, how many buttonholes, how many buttons, whether it was short sleeves or long sleeves. And you just pressed those buttons, and you went round 2 hours later to the other end of the factory, and you just picked up what you wanted. All in boxes, all with plastic covers, so many of each. And there wasn't one person working in that factory. It even swept the floor itself. I saw another picture of a factory producing pistons, exactly the same. To show how far we've gone, there was a seminar not very long ago on where we're going to take the industrial society, held in Florida. And they had politicians and economists, because this is a political problem just as much. We have now great armies of unemployed who are becoming revolutionary. You see, what are we going to do? And we had a paper given at that seminar quite seriously, which suggested the space program might give man a new breathing space. Not for the advantage of getting a man on the moon, but here is an unlimited export market out into space. We could keep everybody fully employed in factories, producing the things we need, put them in rockets, put a match to it, blast it out. And as this genius said, it has one major advantage. Nobody's going to import back at you. And they all pulled their notebooks out and made a note. Good thinking. And in order to keep this momentum going, America, which a few years ago they thought had inexhaustible raw materials, is now running out. It's gouging out into Canada, it's gouging out into the Middle East and Africa, it's gouging out into Australia, and it's taking bigger and bigger mountains of minerals and putting them in giant super tankers, which go faster than ever, consuming more fuel in the process across the ocean, feed it into this economic system so you can keep everybody fully employed, producing more things that'll break down quicker and quicker, so you can put them on rubbish heaps or send them out into the atmosphere, so you can keep everybody fully employed. And we've reached the end of the road. We can't keep it up any further. And look what we've done to God's heritage, to the stuff that he gave us for nothing, the very creation. to provide us our daily bread. And then we as Christians send our kids off into the educational system, which from the age of 5 and 6 onwards is doing assignments on pollution, destruction of the environment, and it's true, what we're doing to our rivers, our creek beds, what we're doing to people, what we're doing to streets. And the message coming through to those kids is that, kiddies, is capitalism or Western Christian civilization. And the answer to that is communism. We can't have freedom any longer. And because kids want something to believe in and are idealistic, we wonder why they come out of those educational systems and stream off into radical movements. And if that isn't good enough, they go off into Eastern cults or drug problems in desperation in a world that is literally tearing their environment apart and now tearing them apart. What's the Christian answer? And you go still to the churches, and the churches say, well, this world is a vale of tears, you know. It's not our job to provide answers in that field. And yet it's God's environment. Give us this day our daily bread. He's given us the means to produce our daily bread, and look what we're doing with it. And yet somewhere in the seed of this frightful destruction, it's a sin past any description, is also the seed of a greater abundance and freedom and love than ever before in mankind's history. If we get back on the way he's given us, life more abundant. And if we can discover the way to utilize this so that it returns to the individual freedom, what a world it could be. But we're not going to discover it through economic systems pouring out of Flinders University. It's got to come through individuals rediscovering the way that God wants us to live. God has economic answers. He's got answers for our economic system, our money system, our political system, our tax system, the way we use the environment, and we dare not turn away and shut our eyes and say this has nothing to do with us. Surely. And thank God the church is beginning to wake up and is beginning to see that. We are responsible. We do have to have an answer. What is the answer? There's a key in this, you know. And the key is this. Every time man discovers a means of creating more and producing more, not creating more, but producing more of the things that are needed, so that we have mountains now around the world, with less effort than ever before, are the costs of production going up or are they going down? And surely you'd have to argue they're going down. The costs of the man who spent a whole day walking around a paddock to get 1 acre of wheat in are 10 times as great as the 10 minutes we take to do that acre a day. What we should be getting as a result of all this, right through the progress of human history, as we've discovered the right sequence of laws, is a cost structure that is gradually coming down the whole time. Our goods should be getting cheaper. Let me give you one example. At the end of the war, to get a motor car off an endless belt took 1,100 man-hours. That's 1,100 men working for an hour. The Holden, the Commodore, now comes off in a fraction under 20 man-hours. It's the same material, but it's a fraction of the human effort. Should that Holden be more expensive or cheaper? Cheaper. There's a little story that illustrates it. Now, I just ask you to consider what sort of environment would Australia be if we just got one thing through, without any new laws, new governments, new anything else. All of a sudden, the Australia that we're living in, you began to find prices dropping. Not our returns and our incomes, but costs coming down. Our taxes, our electricity, the food that we buy, the essentials that we need, gradually coming down. For a very short while, I think we'd glut ourselves. This happened when they took sweet rationing off in Britain at the end of the war. They took it off, and everybody bought Mars bars until they were sick of them. I think it took about a month. And then they discovered in the second month they were eating less Mars bars than they were even when rationing was on. It was a funny thing. People got straight again. So there's going to be that for a while. But then, what would happen to people? And I put it to you that a number of things would happen. That little farm would be able to stay there. Instead of a new phrase ringing through the country, get big or get out, which every farmer dreads and fears, there might even be a new slogan, why not get a little bit smaller? The corner store would come back. Wives who genuinely wanted to, there'd be no force, could drop out of the workforce. Many daren't do it today and be with their kids. Husbands might genuinely take 2 or 3 months holiday each year. You could afford to do it. There was a time we used to do this in Australia. I bet a community up in Queensland not long ago, the whole district took 3 months off to build a hall. Wouldn't dare be able to afford to do that today. Parents could communicate with kids. People could retire earlier, which would open up new opportunities for those who wanted to get into the workforce, who at the moment are totally denied. There's no path through for them. Homes would become available to young people who want to get married. Interest rates would come down. Isn't that the sort of world we'd have time to speak to each other? We're running most of the time now. And sit down and have those community things we used to do, not just in the church, but the 101 other ways we used to live. Go round and look at the Australia of the 1920s and look how many things were done simply, not by government handouts, but people getting together and building the local hall or making a tennis court or doing those sort of things. That's what ought to be happening. Why then is it not being done? There's a little story illustrates this. It's the story of a man who was washed up on a desert island. I do apologize for island stories, but they're often the best way of getting it through. And he was the only survivor. The ship had gone down, and in the middle of this island there were some coconut trees, and his one chance of life was to get some coconuts down. So in the morning, he was pretty unfit, tried to climb up a coconut tree, took half the skin off his knees, got up to the top eventually, hooked an arm round and knocked down a coconut. Plop. Slid down the tree, took all the skin off the other knee, got down to the bottom, ate that coconut. And that gave him the strength the next day to repeat the process. And so he had a little cycle going on the island. Every day his production was a coconut. Every day his consumption was a coconut. If you wanted to work out cost of production, you'd have to say it was 1 coconut over 1 coconut, wasn't it? Say if this is a bit too complicated. Then one day he learnt the knack. He was getting fitter. He'd learned how to climb. Climbed up that tree, hooked his arm round, and down came 4 coconuts. Slid down the tree, and now he was faced with a bewildering array of choices. Either he could be an absolute pig and eat 4, or else he could have 3 days off. But what was cost of production now? Surely it was 1 coconut over 4. It's a quarter of what it had been before. Every time we discover a new way of using God's creation beneficially, things should be getting easier and not more difficult. I tell you that story because I saw this school run by Eric up in Toowoomba a few years ago, and we had 3 economists from the Darling Downs Institute of Advanced Education in the audience. And that they finished when they got to that story. They went right down the back of the hall and they sat round a little table with a pencil and paper. 1 coconut over 4. And when the school had finished, one came up and said to Eric, I'll never forget it. He said, where's the trick? He said, there must be a catch. It's one of these trick questions. But he said, honestly, if that's right, he said, if we can't work it out, he said, that blows every economic theory we've got sky high. Well, I'll tell you, God's creation does blow every man-made economic theory sky high. So we've got to discover this, because locked into this destruction is the very small seed of a breakthrough into a society that you can hardly imagine.
You all know at the moment that one of the great social problems we have is the proliferation of these cults. large numbers of our young people that feel our society's not going anywhere and has got no answers, and they've got to believe in something and they've got to belong to something. Well, of course, they've taken off into these various cults. Now, perhaps you may be a bit shocked when I say that really we belong, I'm speaking generally now, to the most dangerous cult of all. We all accept it. It's called the money cult. The money cult. Now, we were warned a long time ago, I believe, about the money cult, the danger of the money cult. And that might be almost the text of this paper. You can't serve both God and mammon. You've got to make a choice between serving God and mammon. Now, God is represented in the real world, the tremendous productive capacity, the enormous manifestation of life. That's God. There's God. But we're not thinking in those terms at all. All the debates, all the arguments that take place are not about whether we've got enough pounds of butter, whether we can produce enough food, whether we can find enough building materials in Australia to build homes, whether we've got the skills to do it, whether we've got the technology. No, that's not what we're discussing at all. We discuss mammon. We keep on talking about mammon. Is there enough money or some financial problem? So what we've got to do is to stop worshipping mammon. And that's exactly what we're doing. Now, in order to grasp this, it is essential that we look at some basic facts. And in this school, you must have noted by now, it's a systematic approach to this subject. Step by step, we're dealing with demonstrable facts. And I might say that we've conducted this school, or many similar schools in all parts of the world, and I've never struck anyone, anywhere, that can dispute the facts that are being put forward. The only thing you will strike, and this is perhaps a difficulty you may have, I well recall the last time I ran this school in Vancouver, Canada, we had a elderly gentleman who had been brought up in a certain way of life. He had to agree with all the facts, but then came that tremendous difficulty. What you're saying now is, because we don't require everybody in the production system, that in fact we'll have to devise some way of distributing God's gifts without what's normally called work. And he said, I find that impossible to get my mind around. Because he genuinely did believe that we all ought to work at something. Now, the logical end result of that is that you'll all have to be compelled to do something. And there you get back to that philosophical cleavage of the first lecture. Whether you do believe in voluntary association starting with individuals, or whether you believe someone's got to set himself up and compel you to do what he thinks is good for you. You've got to make up your mind. But no one can dispute the facts. And so we're now going to come to look at some more facts. I have suggested we do live in a money culture. I'll even go so far as to say we've got something called black magic, or I suppose more appropriate to call it red magic, as a feature of this cult is the tremendous debt burden, private and public. We've also got the witch doctors. The witch doctors are mainly what we call the economic experts. Now, a lot of jokes told about economic experts, including the one that is in response to the claim by someone that you can't take any notice to the experts. We've had them for the last 50 years, and there doesn't seem to be any consistency about them. Well, now, I disagree with that completely, and I want to just say my long experience is these witch doctors are consistently right. They're consistently right about being wrong. They've been wrong for 50 years consistently, based again on that test, by their fruits you shall know them. I think 50 years, going back that far, is a fair period to test any group of people, and the end result is what you see today. So they're what I call the witch doctors. Now, if you go to Africa, the witch doctors, so that the poor, simple, benighted African believes they've got powers that they don't have. They've got a system of numbo-jumbo. And that sounds so learned that people say, well, it must be very deep, beyond my understanding, and all you do is fall down and you worship whenever out comes some of this numbo-jumbo. Now, we're bombarded with that. It starts back in the universities, which always reminds me of a friend of mine who was studying economics at Melbourne University. And he went back some years later and was looking at the exam papers, and he said, I see nothing's changed. He says, asking the same old question. Oh, yes, he said, the same old questions, but he said they've got different answers now. And you could have quite an hilarious time, if you liked, just going through some of the so-called questions and the answers. But let's have a look at just some examples of the numbo-jumbo. So you pick up the paper and you may be a brave soul and you turn to the financial pages. And one recently I read, the headline said that the liquidity of the banking system is extremely tight. Now, you might ponder on that. What does that exactly mean? The liquidity of the banking system's tight. Well, the word liquidity itself obviously suggests some sort of liquids. Could be water in the bank vaults, or perhaps they're going back on the old rum ration they had in the early days. But then, of course, you try and get your mind around that. Well, now, how can a liquid be tight? Unless you're referring to someone that's had too much of it, and we used to describe them as tight. So you are convinced, well, perhaps this is a pretty deep, dark subject, and you quickly turn over to the sporting pages, which you hope you can understand, or whatever else you're interested in. And you can take example after example. Or, for example, we're told about our financial resources are very strained at the moment. In fact, they're so strained, as you know, that Mr. Chillen, our Minister for Defence, says we've got to cut back very seriously on defence. We can't build as many boats for patrolling as we used to. Now, if, of course, you were a realist, a person that's what I'd called Christ-oriented truth, you would ask the obvious. Goodness me, are we short of building materials? Are we short of skilled engineers to build the boats? Is there a shortage of food to feed the people who are going to build the boats? But when you ask that question, of course, you get the obvious answer, the real answer. Oh, no, we've got an abundance of that, but there's a shortage of money. Our financial resources are strained. How could our financial resources be strained when we're going to look at finance and say that it's not a resource at all? Now, we can easily prove this, irrespective of what you call a financial resource. You can use what we're going to look at in a few minutes, paper money or coins, or even if you think that we're still on the gold standard. And supposing you found yourself in the position where you were told you had $10 million worth of these financial resources, and you might think, well, gee, I've made it. But supposing we put you out in the Simpson Desert. No water, no food, no shelter, nothing. But with $10 million of this tremendous wealth. The question now is the real one. How long would you survive? You might last a couple of days. And you know, you'd discover something we talk about called the discipline of truth. The discipline of truth would teach you in 2 days that irrespective of what form it takes, money is not wealth. It is a claim to wealth. And if there's no wealth to claim, it's completely useless. That's what you would learn. In other words, you'd be stripped free of the numbo-jumbo and away from the witch doctor's influence. And that is why this question's got to be faced. Bearing in mind we've all grown up in what's called the money culture, and from a very early age we've been taught this numbo-jumbo, and we repeat it and believe it, in many cases without even thinking about it. But what I'm asking you today is think about it, even though it may be a painful process. And I want to assure you that I'm sympathetic to those that do find breaking from something you've believed or taken for granted all your life. That's only natural. During the Great Depression, I saw in Sydney an example of exactly what I'm saying to you. We had a meeting. It was dealing with finance, and a rather elderly gentleman, and he wasn't so elderly because I was very young, and you know, when you're very young, anybody that's 40 you think's old. So my grandkids think I'm very old. And we saw this elder gentleman obviously outside the hall looking very distressed. In fact, so distressed someone said, "We'd better get the doctor." He said, "No, it's all right." He said, I'll be right in a minute." And when he recovered his composure, we discovered he was a bank manager. And out it came. He said, "You know, when you've been doing something all your life without understanding what you're actually doing, it does come as a terrible shock to discover that, in fact, I had the power under the system to create, as we're going to explain in a few minutes, to create money. I never knew that." He was quite shaken, quite upset. Let us look at it a little more closely. Money. Money is part of man's history. In fact, it's interesting, we can go back as far as we can, right back to the Babylonian civilization. And there were some people understood the art of controlling other people by persuading them that they were making available something of great benefit to the others, called money in different forms. But always with one proviso, and that's the key to an understanding, always as a debt. Never any credits. Not like God, that makes tremendous credits available, always as a debt. And if you care to study the collapse of the Babylonian civilization or come up to the Roman civilization, it's important to grasp there were three basic features of that disintegrating civilization. Number one, the tremendous burden of debt. That in turn resulted in crushing taxation, which broke the back of the middle class, stripped the rural community of its sturdy peasants, and then produced that other problem, monetary inflation. And monetary inflation is the most insidious type of policy to undermine stability you can imagine. And that's why Rome went down. Rome found no answer to that. It wasn't the superiority of the barbarians outside, it was simply the rot and the collapse inside. So here we are today, and a major feature of this world situation, which Jeremy Lee described in that first lecture, is debt. So astronomical that it's almost impossible now for the mind to encompass it. Debt on such a scale it can't be met, but it gives tremendous power to those that control debt. This takes you into the realm of international politics, the tremendous debt of the communist governments to the people that control debt, the Polish debt, the Romanian debt, the Soviet debt, and much else. And if we don't understand this, we don't understand anything about the world in which we live, not the real world. And yet it's this deep, dark mystery of finance which prevents people from seeing the real world. So let's look at it from a historical point of view. As I've said, from the beginning of man's history, he's devised some means whereby he can exchange goods and services. Interesting, the word pecuniary is one you might think about. It's one that's still used in financial documents. Pecuniary is derived from pecus, the Latin meaning cattle. Because at one time, cattle was used as the basis of all wealth, which was obvious enough because from cattle you got the milk, from which you made the butter, the cheese. You also got the meat, the hides, the clothing, and so on. Cattle was treated as real wealth. In fact, in some parts of the world they're still used as wealth, some primitive societies.
Now, the next step was very logical. Bill Smith found it a bit arduous to drive 6 head of cattle up to the corn merchant every time he wanted some bags of corn. So he hit on the idea of cutting from some of the hides of his killed animals leather discs and putting his stamp on it and offering them to the corn merchant, saying, you know, my credit's good. Jeremy Lee dealt with that credit, credo. You know I can, at any time, meet any demand. And you know, if you'll think about it, anything which people will accept in exchange for their goods and services is money. You've got to all believe in it. So if you travel abroad, it's no good producing these dollar bills and asking them to accept them up in Japan. You might get some rude rebuffs. Some have even rudely said to me they look like jam tin covers, but I assure them that we can use them here anyhow. No, we've all got different pieces of paper, but you've all got to believe in them. If you don't believe in them, they're no use. Now, I've had the greatest difficulty in the United Kingdom. Some of you may have had the experience. For example, Bank of Northern Ireland notes are legal currency in all parts of the United Kingdom. It's extremely difficult, I found, just going from Northern Ireland to Wales to get in some Welsh centres those Irish notes accepted, because they don't see them a great deal. And may I say, I hope this doesn't upset the Scots here, but there's a funny aspect, if you can see the funny aspect of the great train robbery. You see, Mr. Biggs and Kay really, what they did was, they grabbed a lot of notes, these bits of paper, we're going to look at them, because those bits of paper called the bank notes, they were all being sent back to London. And what were they going to do with them there? Well, the Bank of England was going to put them in an incinerator, and Mr. Biggs and Kay thought it was rather a backward sort of a policy. They thought if they grabbed them and redistribute them, that'd be a much better policy. But the tragedy is they didn't like the Scottish notes, and they threw those away. They didn't think they'd be too acceptable where they were going to do business. So every bank forger knows this. So if he makes a $5 bill, and for all I know, because I'm no expert, that may be a forged dollar bill, but so long as everybody will accept it, it operates as money. But if someone says, oh, that's a forgery, the last chap that's seen it, bad luck, you've had it. Money. So there we go back to our man that's creating those leather coins. Tremendous advance. It made it easier to trade and commerce. Now, please note, the man that owned the wealth, he was also issuing the tickets against it. He wasn't borrowing. They were his. You go on from there to the next stage when, of course, rare metals like gold and silver were also used as money. Then the next development was those interesting people called the goldsmiths, because they had the biggest banks and vaults. So if you had 4 bars of gold, you didn't want to have them round, because apparently even those days the socialist spirit was abroad in the land, that people wanting to share with you. So you went and you deposited them with Mr. Goldsmith, and all Mr. Goldsmith did, Mr. Goldsmith took a bit of parchment paper and he gave you a receipt. And he wrote out, received from Butler Eric D. Esquire, 4 bars of gold, the date. He had my 4 bars of gold, 90s bit of paper. And that bit of paper is the forerunner of these, because it wasn't long that I discovered, well, what was the sense, every time I wanted to do business, going back to the goldsmith, give him his receipt, getting the 4 bars of gold out, or 2 bars, and give it to Joe Blow, and he did the same. I said to Joe Blow, well, here's one of Goldsmith's receipts. And he looked at it and he believed, okay, that's fine, and he used these. And that was a tremendous advance. Now, the next step was obvious. One goldsmith one day noticed that only a small percentage of demands were made on those receipts at any one time. And there was a period of expanding economies. People were wanting to borrow. Why not create more of those bits of paper than he had gold bars? And they discovered that it was about a ratio of 10 to 1. So long as he didn't overdo it, he was unlikely to get caught. So away he went now creating bits of paper, receipts, and now said also, because I'm loaning this to you, I've got to charge you interest. And you say, well, what an incredible racket that was. You call it what you like, but it was part of the evolution of money. And do you know, right up until the First World War, to show you what people can believe, the power of black magic, the overwhelming majority of people believe that those bits of paper were backed by gold. Some of you are note collectors, or if you're not, you've got friends. The old Bank of England notes before the First World War had on them clearly, pay the bearer, upon demand, 1 golden sovereign. Now, people wouldn't want to be carrying golden sovereigns around their pockets, a bit heavy, and they wore holes in the pockets. Much better to carry these around. But everybody believed that. Everybody was convinced that those receipts were backed by what was called wealth, gold, until the outbreak of the First World War. Well, whether the Germans started the rumour or not, it doesn't matter, but suddenly the idea spread that there was going to be what's called a run on the bank. So everybody went in and said, well, thank you very much, here's your receipts back, we'd like the real stuff. And the Bank of England paid out, you know, safe as the Bank of England used to say. They paid out for a few days and then they had to close their doors because they had issued 10 times more receipts than they had sovereigns. Well, you can't have that sort of a crisis in the middle of a war. So the British government declared a type of moratorium, said, don't panic, friends. They got hold of a very good designer who drew some very fancy work. They got hold of Bradbury and Sons, the note printers, and they got the plates made, and away they went running the printing presses. They were called the famous Bradbury's Flimsies, and they ran them off in millions, distributed them around the banks, and the banks said, all right, you can all come in, bring those other bits of paper in, we'll give you another bit. And it says on here it's backed by the whole nation, underwritten by the government. And people have never seen them in their lives before, thank you very much, and they hand one bit of paper, I haven't got another bit of paper. And you say, I never learnt that bit of history when I went to school. That is right. A lot of bits of history you never learnt at school. We never learnt at school that perhaps the basic cause of the American colonists revolting against the British government wasn't that nice little story about the Boston Tea Party. It had to do with the fact the American colonists had decided, instead of borrowing their money from the Bank of England, they'd create their own. And they had a tremendous system. And the result was they had comparative prosperity in the 13 colonies while the mother country was in poverty. And those that control these matters said, that's no jolly good, that's got to be stopped. This is all in the real history. Benjamin Franklin understood this, went to England, explained that all to the people there. But I say again, this is part of how history's blotted out. So you see, money is really anything which people accept in exchange for their goods and services. It's a tremendously convenient system. In the same way that we find the ticket system, and it's only a sophisticated ticket system, like running a railway. Now, it's no use having a railway system if you haven't got some method of allocating the seats and you've got tickets. Now, I think you'd agree it would be an amazing state of affairs if, for example, at the local railway station, there was the train, there's the real wealth, the real credit, Jeremy Lee explained here, all there, steams up, train's half empty, long queue of people, and they're all shouting, wondering what's going on. And out comes the station master and said, well, we've just consulted our witch doctor, he wouldn't say that, but our economic advisor, and he says we're short of tickets. Sorry, friends, all come back in a couple of months, by which time we hope things will improve, and away the train goes half empty. You've never seen that happen. Train organisations issue enough seats for the number of, enough tickets for the number of seats. And if they're well run, they don't sell 4 tickets for the one seat, so you've got 4 people trying to get into the one seat. 1 ticket, 1 seat. And at the end of the journey, if they're well run, you hand the ticket in and they're destroyed. A tremendous system of tickets. But please, again, note, the railway organisation doesn't get a private printer to print the tickets. and allow the private printer to say, well, look, the tickets belong to us, and we're only going to loan them to you and going to charge you 14.5% interest. The railway organisation says, because we're backing this, the tickets belong to us. We'll pay you for doing the job. Theatre tickets exactly the same. Now, that's all money is, a sophisticated ticket system. And to suggest that our real world's got to be governed by the manipulation of tickets is simply a surrender to mammon. It's a surrender to abstractionism. To say that you can't do something because of a shortage of money is rather like saying, well, look, we can't publish this book. We haven't got enough numbers to number the pages with. That's what you're saying. In other words, money should be the servant. All right, we go from there and come back to it if you like. And look at the realities of the modern system. So first of all, we've got these bits of paper here. And it's amazing, you know, when you talk about this to some people, particularly these smart people, particularly the sophisticated, oh yes, they look very superior, almost pat you on the head, son. You're one of those funny money people. You know, you believe in printing press money. You know, you've heard it all. Well, I'm amazed always when I hear this, because I just wonder then, if these are not run off on printing presses, where do they come from? Do they suggest every Monday morning at the Reserve Bank they go around, they're growing on trees and just pluck a number off? Of course they run off on printing presses. And what's wrong with that? They've got to be produced somehow. So these are produced in different denominations, without going into the techniques in too much detail, under the authority of the Reserve Bank, the central bank. We also have the mint, and it turns out these pieces of metal here you call coins. And many people believe that's all the money we got. Well, you can check the figures for yourself. This is an interesting exercise. Take it up with your politician. That's the man you pay. He's your servant. And ask him, what is the total amount of these notes and coins, and then what's the total amount of money in the circulation in this country at the moment? And you'll find this is only a small fraction of the total amount of money we use. A very small fraction. It's called the cash. The great bulk of it, over 95%, is created not by running printing presses or at the mint. It's produced in a much simpler manner. It's produced by the creation of what we call financial credit. To come right to the point, what we have today is a banking system which creates the bulk of our money in the simple process of creating what's called credit. Against what? Against that real credit which Jeremy Lee's been discussing. So now we come to the most, to many people, staggering fact of all, although why they should be staggered when your common sense should indicate the truth, apart from all the books you can look at. No one disputes it any longer, they just don't talk about it, hoping you won't talk about it, is that the bulk of this money is made available by this simple process of writing figures in books. They don't even write them anymore because we've got electronic computers now. Which means that whether it's A. Smith or a government obtains a loan from the banking system, that loan is automatically an expansion of our money supply. So if I go along to my banker and I've got the real credit, that's the productive capacity, I've got some real assets, and I say, well, look, if I've got an overdraft, I'd like to lift it from 5,000 to 10,000, all right, if he agrees, all he does is write in the bank documents, Eric D. Butler, limit $10,000. And he gives me, or I'm permitted to buy one of these books here, you've all seen them, it's called a checkbook. And now I can go out, so I'm going to do some building, and I want to buy some timber and some iron and all the rest, and it all comes, the first order, to $873.10. So all I do is write that out, exact amount there, and then I sign my name there, And I just whip that bit of paper out and I give him that. And that's just as good as these. Just as good as these, if he accepts the cheque. In fact, they're much better because these are more hygienic than these. We spread all our germs with these. These are nice, fresh, new cheques. So he deposits that in his bank account. And his bank account sends it back to mine, and all they do is shuffle the exact amount from one side of the ledger to the other. And I can write cheques up to the amount that I'm allowed to write them. Now, the person who's believed the witch doctor says, well, I find this flabbergasting, because I was just listening to our Treasurer, John Howard, and he said on television, you know, what's said on television seems to be much more important than if it's said anywhere else. I saw him say this. The real reason we're short of money at the moment, and we've got to put the interest rate up, but not enough people are depositing any money. You see, if they don't deposit any money, we can't lend it. Now, I want to challenge any member of this audience, I've been putting this right around the world, to any person who can show me a bank statement that's been reduced by even 1 cent so that someone else can be loaned some money. And I want to tell you this, if I got my bank statement and I saw there's a debit of $500 and I don't recall writing a cheque for that. First thing, probably get on to the wife. She might have had a shopping spree. No. And I went down to the bank and said, listen, John, what's the meaning of this? And he said, oh, don't worry. Joe Blow was in and he wanted to borrow 500, so I just took 500 from your account to loan him. That never happens. You've never heard of it happen. It's an insult to common sense to suggest it does happen. And yet every day you hear that nonsense. Pure, undiluted black magic. Now, if you care to read, and I'll recommend a few little books, they're quite simple. The rate of creating this sort of money is governed by a formula which takes you right back to the Reserve Bank, and they decide. Don't say, look, if it's just as simple as this, I went to see my local bank manager and a good friend of mine, and I only wanted to borrow a couple of thousand. No, he said, I'm terribly sorry, Eric. You know, liquidity's very tight at the moment. Or if he did lend it to you, he said, I'm terribly sorry. Interest rates are now up to 14.5%. But then don't blame him. He's just an administrator. He's only administering a policy that's fixed elsewhere. It is fixed by the Reserve Bank. And the Reserve Bank fixes this in accordance with some of the theories they've got. But the fact I want to get across to you is the volume of money coming out of this system is governed by the Reserve Bank. Not only are they creating it, as you repay your loan, if you're one of the lucky ones, like that railway ticket, it's cancelled out of existence. Now, as a system, it's tremendously, well, I'd say it's perfect. It is bookkeeping. You've got records there. It's all the information there. And theoretically, as we produce goods and services like the train service and use it and consume it, and if we're destroying the tickets, it should be perfect. But there's one thing we all observe. The system can only keep working by creating more debt. The debt gets bigger and bigger. The interest bills get higher and higher. And the reason for this is to be discovered by having a quick look at how we're trying to work our finance economic system. And as Jeremy Lee explained to you in that other lecture, so long as you keep on insisting that you can't get access to any sort of money unless you're engaged in something called work, no matter how useless it may be, then the mathematics of this situation, as I'm going to explain, are beyond argument. So let's just for a few minutes have a look at this very simple little diagram we got up here on the chart. First of all, there's the banking system. Now, that's the only source of money, apart from that small amount that comes out of the Treasury and from the note department of the government bank. That's the only source. I know people talk loosely about how they're making money. Well, you look a very honest audience to me, and I'm quite sure there's not one of you making money. And take my advice, don't think of starting, because if you get caught, you'll get about 30 years with no remissions at all. You can murder your mother-in-law, and as long as you've got a good lawyer and you can plead you're in a psychiatric state, you'll probably get out in 10 years. But you cannot make money. That's a very serious crime. You cannot do that. So you don't make money, you get money from somewhere else, or he in turn's got it from somewhere else, but ultimately it all comes from there. There is no other source. So without going any further, it is surely elementary, if out of that banking system for any given period, to make it very simple, $1,000 comes, and then you're told there's a charge on that called interest, the next obvious question is, where do you get the interest from? It hasn't been distributed to you. Well, at that stage you're told, well, don't worry about that. Just borrow some more so you can keep on trying to keep up. On that one principle alone, that one factor alone, you've got to keep going deeper and deeper into debt. That's simple arithmetic. Not unless you've discovered something I've been looking for all around the world. Perhaps some of you have. If so, please put your hand up quickly. Have you discovered anyone that you can borrow yourself out of debt? Has anybody discovered that? I've never discovered anybody could borrow himself out of debt. The amazing thing is that apparently governments think they can do that. It is mathematically impossible. Well, that's part of the mythology, part of the black magic. Industry, in the main, operates on credits it borrows from the system. Industry does two things. It employs, so long as it's not completely automated, as Jeremy Lee says, it distributes some wages, salaries, and hopefully dividends. It's also got a stream of goods being produced, and it's got prices on them. Now, it's elementary. You don't need to be an economic genius. Don't get baffled by this. You see, I've even had a couple of politicians sit down and go through this, and they admitted they could follow this. So you'll have no difficulty. Don't get worried about that at all. Now, it's elementary that if that industry is going to remain in business, into those prices, it's got to have, at the very minimum, it's got to put all wages and all salaries, hasn't it? Isn't it true it's also got to charge interest? That's got to go into prices. Now, isn't it also true it has a few other costs, such as depreciation and perhaps reserves put aside? Then there's the other little problem you might look at. Look at wages. The wage earner doesn't get all his wages, because business today is an unpaid tax collector, and it's got to put its hand in before he gets it and take a part out. So that being the case, at the marketplace, it's elementary that total wages are far less than total prices. And the immediate reaction is, well, if that's right, Mr. Butler, well, there must be an unsold pile of goods that you can't dispose of. And there would be, if it weren't for a number of other things that are done. At this stage, we're told, well, in order to try and shift the mountain of goods, why not mortgage your future under something called hire purchase? So while your bank manager may say up this end of the counter, we can't help you, sir, but if you just go down there, there's a company down there that'll be very delighted to help you, and you'll find the interest rates are much higher. So now you can mortgage your future wages, so you can go and get that washing machine, which is in the shop, it's been produced, you can see it, and take it away. So hire purchase debt has become a major factor of every industrialized society. In other words, we've got to keep borrowing against the future to try and keep the system operating. And hire purchase debt gets higher and higher and higher. You can take the figures, they become astronomical. So that helps to shift a little bit of the production. But then there's still production that's got to be shifted. At that stage, governments have something called deficit budgets. Now, most people don't understand deficit budgets. They're very simple. A government brings down a budget and it works out, these geniuses up at Canberra, that we're going to have X amount of income, but we're going to spend X plus 2, the 2 being the deficit. Where does the deficit come from? It's created in the same way all money's created, on the authority of the Reserve Bank. What's it created against? Against your assets. And you may say, well, when do we get some credits against their assets? You don't. All you get's debt, all the time. So they write that up as debt, the government spends it, and that helps to try and keep the economy rolling a little further. And you resort to all the other tactics, including the one by Jeremy Lee, built-in obsolescence. But we've still got a surplus. We can't dispose of it. Now what do? Well, we export it. Well, now we're having great difficulty exporting it to people like ourselves, the British or the Americans, because we're all trying to do the same thing. And there's only one part of the world we can export it to, and that's to the Soviet Union or to the communist countries, because, you see, they've got real shortages because their system doesn't produce too much except munitions and propaganda. But you say, but look, how are they going to pay us? Ladies and gentlemen, they don't pay you at all. You see, it was pointed out a long time ago by a man called Lenin, the time will come when the decadent capitalists, unable to solve their own internal problems, unable to work out an answer, all they'll do is be competing one with the other to send their surplus production to us. Thus, he said, becoming deaf mutes. And one of the lesser informed comrades, Lenin was informed, he understood the game. He said, but Comrade Lenin, as they won't want too much back, how are we going to sort of pay for it? And Lenin gave that cynical reply, they'll also provide us with the credits. Thus, he said, becoming blind deaf mutes. They will provide, he said, the rope with which we'll hang them. So here we are in Australia. You'll all recall 2.5 years ago, nearly 2.5 years ago, our Prime Minister, I'm just giving this as an instance, how we're all geared to this. He said we were faced with the greatest threat to world peace since the end of the Second World War and the Soviet went to Afghanistan. In the 2 years, 4 months since then, Australian exports to the Soviet Union have quadrupled. Massive economic blood transfusions from the West to keep the Soviet system afloat, which in turn generates an international crisis. Well, who provides all the credits? The same people that got the monopoly of creating it, the great international banking houses. So in essence, you see, we're all working for them. The communists are working for them, we're working for them, because we're told the only way you can keep this system going is going into more and more debt. And that means more and more controls. That means inevitable inflation. That is why you can predict with absolute certainty no one can stop inflation while you do this. And that is why these communist trade unions, they understand, they don't believe a word of what we're told. Let's have a strike and put wages up. That'll benefit the worker. The first thing that employer's got to do, industry's got to go to the banking system and borrow some more at the prevailing rate of interest to pay the wages, but that puts the wage earner in a new tax bracket. So all you do is feed the taxation monster. And that leaves industry in a worse position than ever. It's got to try and recover it by putting prices up still further. The communist understands this. He knows you're going to wreck our society if you continue doing it. Now, those are the basic facts of how the system's working. All you've got to do is understand the mechanism to understand it's a matter of arithmetic. If you go on doing this, what's going to happen? And that's why, for example, those of us been running these schools have been able to predict this accurately and say no one can really satisfactorily deal with inflation or any of the problems under that rule. Well, the next thing is obviously, well, what are we going to do? Well, there's a number of things you can do. If you can first free your mind from the mesmerism of finance and see it's just bookkeeping, and grasp that truth, God's universe is tremendously rich, and that in fact we should be getting some sort of a dividend out of our inheritance, Then it's just simply a matter of what is the most realistic way to start distributing it. So I just put a couple of suggestions to you. For example, if a government for a deficit budget can sell, we say, write $1,000 million against us as a debt, why can't it write $1,000 million for a change for a bit of credit against what I'm talking about? And why not distribute that credit perhaps along these lines? Supposing we said, all right, instead of talking about the shorter working week, we talked about the shorter working life. So we reduced the retiring age from 65 for a start. Perhaps we come back, not too excessive, perhaps we come back to 55. And those that want to leave the workforce, that stage, first of all, they've made a lifetime of their contribution to expanding the real credit of the country. They're fairly matured people. If they're not matured at 55, they're not going to start to smarten up after that too much. They're probably becoming grandkids. They're fairly responsible, so therefore they could move into a situation with more free time and security without, as Jeremy Lee's suggesting, spending it up at the pub. They're more likely to be more interested in running the Boy Scouts or doing all the sort of jobs that have got to be done. Or they might just take up carpentry. Or they might even go fishing, and that'd be much more constructive than a lot of people doing at the moment. They'd become free people with enough years left to spiritualize their lives. To, as Jeremy Lee said, grow old gracefully. Because physically we know as a society we can do that. Or you could do a number of other things. All our returned servicemen, many others, pensions could be paid out of the credits instead of writing up debts. All against that enormous productive capacity we've got. If we keep that in mind all the time, we know as a society we can afford to do it. Easily afford to do it. That would enable our young people to be brought into the workforce. And might I just say, expressing a personal opinion, I would make it compulsory for young people to take a job. I'd cut all welfare off, because they need the discipline, so that they also can see they've got to make their contribution, but always knowing as they improve the real credit, perhaps the retiring age can be progressively reduced. Everyone's got an incentive. Now, you can think up a number of other ideas that could be done. The interest rates could be dropped dramatically, because we know that then you'd be issuing credit simply on the true basis, what's it costing to do it? And the best estimates would be down as low as 1 or 2%. What a dramatic impact that would have. So there's no problem there once you get your mind around this. But then comes the real difficulty. Well, how are you going to get this done? And who's going to do it? Are you suggesting, Mr. Butler, we form a new political party? That's exactly the wrong way. All that amounts to is dividing the community up a little further, and some groups saying, well, look, if only we had the power, we'll be different to all those other people. No, this is not going to be changed until such time as enough people back here in the community stop worshipping money, mammon, and say, look, we are Christians. God's abundance is there. It is absolute blasphemy to say it cannot be distributed, or that we go on doing what we're doing at the present time. And I must say, to put a personal view, I regard the way in which we're treating that tremendous gift from God as absolute blasphemy. I cannot believe that's how God intended us to use our heritage. And this is a challenge, isn't it, to Christians? And it raises the question, which I'm sure my colleague, Mr. Tony Morris, will deal with in the last lecture, of the role of the Christian in this. Because the Christian's got to give the leadership. Surely only the Christian's going to insist as a society we've got to stop worshipping mammon and start worshipping God. But he's got to equip himself. Please, he doesn't have to be an expert. All he's got to understand are basic principles. As I've often said, take a motor car. Now, I'm no automotive engineer, but I do understand the basic principles, the principles. I know, for example, you put water in the radiator. You don't put water in the petrol tank. I know that a motor car has got a system which, after the petrol has been injected into the cylinders, it's ignited, whatever terminology, by an electric spark. I understand all that. And it's gears and the clutches and the wheels go round, and I know how to handle the wheel. I know enough to know if something starts to go wrong, I can take it to an expert and say, Joe, fix it. And I know enough about principles to know that if he says he can't fix it, there's someone else who can fix it. Now that means we've got to get a new relationship towards our politicians, who in turn have a lot of experts. Now the first thing we've got to do is to get those experts where they should be, on tap, not on top, where they've been for too long. In other words, we've got to say to them, look, we know that this society of ours can operate much more satisfactorily. We know it is an abundant universe. We know these tremendous gifts are there to be distributed. We know that finance is a man-made system. It can be changed. And we're telling you we want much better results than we're getting. And if you don't know how to get them, well, you better move on and make way for someone else who will undertake the job. That's where we've got to start. We've got to produce a new sort of a movement. But a movement of people who first freed themselves from mental bondage to financial tyranny, that no longer worship figures and are bamboozled by statistics, who don't get confused with the difference between a pound of butter and a shadow. They know the pound of butter is the important thing, not the shadow. So you can see it's really a question of us changing completely our approach. And the Christian's the one that's got to pave the way. And I'd like to conclude by saying it's a great tragedy in this area that over 2,000 years of history, Christian history, there have been some outstanding Christians who have given leads on this. There was a time when usury was condemned as a very serious mortal sin. In fact, those caught at it, the equivalent of it, were put in the stocks. Up until the First World War, there were a number of churchmen did speak out. The Dr. Temple, Archbishop of Canterbury. Since the Second World War, we've had only one report, which was commissioned by the Congregational Church of Scotland, produced a tremendous document which hopefully should come back into print shortly, Money, a Christian View. Tremendous document. You'd have thought all the churches would have taken that document up and had it discussed. No, they didn't want to hear about it. And that's why we are where we are today. And that's why we've got to get this regeneration process underway, which Jeremy Lee spoke about. So that's the real challenge to it.